Hello. In this second video on Caribbean slave revolts, and the two that follow, I will talk about one of the most important events in modern world history, the successful slave uprising on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, and the eventual emergence of the independent nation of Haiti. Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, roughly the western third of the large island of Hispaniola, was itself the largest and richest of France's Caribbean island colonies. French since 1697, it had experienced a meteoric rise, so that by the late 18th century it had become the leading center of sugar and coffee production in the world, and the greatest source of wealth in the Caribbean. Over 1,000 ships a year were engaged with its trade, and its chief port cities of Port-au-Prince and Cap-Français, now Cap-Haïtien, were two of the most opulent and sophisticated in the Americas. For the French, it was the pearl of the Antilles. This all quickly ended in a massive outburst of revolutionary violence that saw the only successful slave uprising in world history, and the birth of the second newly independent country in the Americas. Like the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution showed contemporaries the possibilities and dangers of sudden social change, and the reality of the hatreds between dominant social groups and those they oppressed. For black slaves throughout the Americas, it provided the hope of freedom. Saint-Domingue's population was sharply divided on almost caste-like lines. Most of the people of the colony were slaves, almost 500,000 in number. Many were recently arrived from Africa, and the majority led short, hard lives as field hands working on the large plantations. Local society was dominated by the Grands Blancs, the small, rich, white elite, who included rich merchants and higher officials, as well as the great planters. There were also a more numerous grouping of poorer whites, the Petits Blancs, the total white population being about 35,000. By comparison, we should note the total white population of Canada in 1763 was about 65,000. There was also a large and influential group of freedmen, affranchis, the gens de couleur, some 28,000 in number, most of them mulattoes, but some of them freed black slaves and their descendants, and there were also communities of runaway slaves, maroons, living in the mountains. This complex system of caste and class generated three main sets of tensions. Firstly, between the great mass of slave labor and their masters, the slaves being mostly kept down by fear and the brutality of their owners and overseers, and in turn inspiring fear. Secondly, between the whites of all social classes and the gens de couleur, and thirdly, between the richer and poorer whites on class-based grounds of wealth and privilege. The interplay of these tensions determined the course of the revolution. In purely economic terms, the gens de couleur were natural allies of the whites. They included men of wealth and breeding, many of whom owned both land and slaves, but social divisions were so strong that they remained apart. Excluded from the polite society of the white elite which they wished to join, they were also subject to legal discrimination, being banned from following any of the learned professions, such as law or medicine, or from carrying weapons, regarded as a badge of rank. Resentful of the inferior status forced upon them, they were largely despised by all classes of whites, but simultaneously had no common feeling with the mass of black slaves, who were their obvious social inferiors. The events that led up to the Haitian Revolution began with local responses to the news of the revolution in France. The French Revolution of June 1789 and the subsequent dramatic twists and turns of metropolitan political life had a massive and complex impact on Saint-Domingue. Rich whites, poorer whites, and the mulattoes and free blacks all saw the early developments of the revolution and its ideas in different ways. Some of the Grands Blancs saw events in France as an opportunity to establish a semi-autonomous state with themselves as its rulers. Accordingly, they sent off delegates to the meeting of the Estates General in Versailles. Thinking that liberty could mean their own freedom from metropolitan control, they were shocked to discover the very different ideas embodied in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, with its lofty statements about natural rights and the equality of men. For their part, mulattoes in Paris were distressed that the Declaration of the Rights of Man was not intended to include them. In the Caribbean, only whites were to enjoy the rights of man. Intense discussions followed, with the recently established French Abolitionist Society, the Amis-des-Noirs, playing a prominent role. Formed in imitation of the British Abolitionist Society, the Amis-des-Noirs lacked the dynamism and facility in mass mobilization of the British original. Nevertheless, while largely confined to a small number of Paris intellectuals, it included men such as the reformist aristocrat Condorcet, who were now prominent proponents of the new order in France, and they both presented a strong critique of the claims of the planters and also raised the issues of racial equality and slavery, which had hitherto not been widely considered in French political and intellectual circles. Colonial affairs now suddenly became a matter of political interest, and it became clear that there was no sympathy for the planter-backed colonial delegates. Disillusioned, the delegates turned instead to the king, gaining permission from him to convene a colonial assembly responsible only to the crown. The debates radicalized some of the mulattoes in Paris, notably Vincent-Oge, a wealthy and French-educated mulatto who returned to Saint-Domingue determined to effect change. Unable to get the colonial administration to grant free men of color equal status to whites, he led a small and short-lived rebellion in October-November 1790. Oge's brutal execution, he was broken on the wheel, in February 1791, attracted much sympathy for his cause in Paris, and in May 1791 the Constituent Assembly granted full political rights to all freeborn mulattoes and blacks, including the right to vote for provincial and colonial assemblies. But local officials in Saint-Domingue, backed by the planters, then refused to implement the decree, and there was talk of succession and independence. The killing of the rebels also enraged the mulattoes in general. Public attacks by whites on mulattoes had already become common, and the mulattoes now had martyrs for their cause. Thus there could be no sure alliance between the whites and even the richest men of color in the coming storm, even though they shared a common interest in preserving existing property ownership, including of slaves. And Oge himself had specifically stated that he did not intend to end slavery. While the whites and mulattoes were in deepening confrontation, neither side noticed any signs of the impending explosion amongst the slaves on the northern plain. Traditionally, the start of the slave revolt is dated to a secret meeting held by the voodoo priest Dutty-Boukman in a remote wood on the 21st of August 1791, during which slaves from many plantations in the north came together and took a communal oath to rise up against the planters. The insurrection began a week later, with simultaneous attacks across the plain, during which whites were massacred and cane fields and equipment and the planters' houses were burnt. Surviving whites fled for their lives to Cap Français, whilst marauding bands of slaves went from plantation to liberate their fellows. The flames and smoke were visible across the whole area. With trained soldiers and better weaponry, the whites were able to retaliate, but they were not able to reimpose order. The northern province, hitherto one of the most productive plantation areas in the world, was quickly reduced to a smoking ruin. One observer estimated that around 2,000 whites were killed during the first 2 months of the uprising, and some 10,000 slaves had died in the fighting or the resultant famine, or had been executed. Most of the surviving northern planters fled to Cuba, where they played a major role in improving the island's sugar production, or Jamaica or Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, in August 1791, the Paris government had responded to the tensions between the whites and the mulattoes in Saint-Domingue by revoking the newly granted political rights of the mulattoes, probably only serving to inflame the situation, so that in October, Port-au-Prince, hitherto untouched by the conflict, was burned down during fighting between whites and mulattoes. These two separate conflicts, the slave rebellion in the north and the largely southern struggle between the whites and the mulattoes, marked the beginning of what became a complex series of struggles, with shifting alliances between different groups of armed men belonging to various castes and classes. There were also further shifts of French government policy, the General Assembly re-enfranchising the free-born mulattoes and blacks in April 1792, and sending an army of 6,000 men in July 1792 to enforce the edict. The dominant political figure in Saint-Domingue now became Leger-Felicite-Sonthonox, the head commissioner and an ardent revolutionary. Finding that the colonial authorities refused to honor the edict, he allied with the mulattoes in the south in September. Then, in 1793, he faced new challenges, as newly Republican France declared war on Britain and Spain in February, and both powers threatened Saint-Domingue militarily with the support of local royalists and slave owners. Seeking allies, Sonthonox declared the rebel slaves, who had already freed themselves, to be legally free, an emancipation declaration which was then endorsed by the National Assembly in Paris on the 4th of February 1794. By this point, many more white refugees had left the island, many thousands heading for Baltimore. I will continue the story in the next video. Thank you.